I never thought my $30 roof rake would lead to criminal charges. But here we are, standing in my driveway in suburban Michigan while my HOA president explains why she has the authority to confiscate my snow removal equipment. The morning air bit at my exposed skin as I watched Margaret Templeton, clipboard in hand, gesturing wildly at the snow-covered roof of my modest two-story colonial on Maple Ridge Drive in Rochester Hills. This woman had made my life miserable for the better part of 2 years, but this was a new low even for her. Mr. Zimmerman, Section 4.7 of the revised HOA bylaws clearly states that all exterior maintenance equipment must be stored out of sight when not in active use, Margaret said, her nasally voice cutting through the February morning like a rusty saw. She wore a puffy purple jacket that made her look like an oversized grape, and her highlighted blonde hair was teased into that signature Karen bob that screamed middle management and entitlement. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. Margaret, I used it yesterday. I was planning to use it again today. The rake was leaning against my garage for maybe 12 hours. The bylaws don't specify a time limit, she snapped, writing something on her clipboard with aggressive strokes. This is your third violation this month. First the trash cans on a Tuesday instead of Monday night, then your Christmas lights stayed up until January 8th, and now this flagrant disregard for proper equipment storage. It's a roof rake, not a nuclear weapon, I said, trying to keep my voice level. And those Christmas lights. My mother was in the hospital. I had slightly more important things on my mind than your arbitrary decoration deadlines. Margaret's expression didn't soften one bit. If anything, her pale blue eyes got harder, colder. Rules exist for everyone, Mr. Zimmerman. Your personal circumstances don't exempt you from community standards. Now, I'm going to have to confiscate this item until you can demonstrate proper storage solutions. You're going to what? I stepped forward, genuinely shocked. You can't just take my property. As HOA president, I have the authority to secure any items in violation of community standards until the homeowner comes into compliance. She grabbed the aluminum roof rake before I could react, yanking it away from where it leaned against my garage door. You can retrieve it once you've built proper storage and submitted photos for architectural committee approval. I stood there, mouth hanging open like an idiot, watching this 45-year-old woman march down my driveway with my roof rake over her shoulder like some kind of demented suburban warrior. My neighbor Tom Chen was getting his mail across the street, and he just shook his head sympathetically. Everyone in Whispering Pines subdivision knew Margaret was crazy with power, but most people just paid their fines and kept their heads down. I tried that approach for 2 years, and clearly, it wasn't working. The thing about Margaret Templeton was that she hadn't always been this bad. When I moved into Whispering Pines 3 years ago, the HOA was run by a retired couple, the Hendersons, who took a pretty relaxed approach to enforcement. Sure, they'd send you a reminder if your grass got too high or your mailbox needed painting, but they understood that people had lives beyond obsessing over neighborhood aesthetics. Then the Hendersons moved to Florida, and Margaret swept into power on a platform of restoring community standards. In reality, this meant she'd appointed herself the arbiter of everything from approved door wreath colors to acceptable dog walking routes. I went inside my house and called my buddy Derek Patterson, who worked as a paralegal downtown. Hypothetically, I said, can an HOA president just steal your stuff? Derek laughed. Man, what did Margaret do now? She literally just walked off with my roof rake. Said she's holding it hostage until I build some kind of storage solution and get it approved by her committee. That's insane, Derek said, his laughter dying. But technically, it depends on what your HOA governing documents say. Some of these agreements give the board pretty broad enforcement powers. You still have your copy. I pulled out the massive binder I'd received at closing, the one I'd barely skimmed because who actually reads 100 pages of dense legalese about lawn ornament restrictions? For the next hour, I went through it with Derek on speakerphone, and the more we read, the worse it got. The documents did give the HOA board enforcement authority, but the language was vague enough that Margaret was definitely stretching the interpretation. Nowhere did it explicitly say she could confiscate personal property. Your best bet is to file a complaint with the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, Derek suggested. They oversee homeowner associations, but honestly, that's a long process. In the meantime, you might want to just play along, get your rake back, and then decide if you want to fight the bigger battle. I hated that advice, but I knew he was right. I needed that roof rake. The weather forecast called for another 8 inches of snow over the next few days, and the last thing I needed was ice dams forming on my roof because I couldn't clear the snow properly. That was how my upstairs bathroom had flooded last year, costing me $3,000 in repairs. Margaret knew this too, which is why she'd targeted that specific tool, but something about this situation gnawed at me as I made lunch. Margaret had been escalating her harassment for months. It started with the petty violation notices, but lately, she'd been showing up at my house unannounced, taking pictures, measuring things. Last month, she'd threatened to fine me because my garage door was the wrong shade of almond compared to the approved color palette. My painter had used the exact color code from the HOA documents, but Margaret insisted it was off by several shades. The whole thing was madness. That's when I got an idea. It was probably a stupid idea, possibly even a bit paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed insurance against Margaret's increasingly unhinged behavior. I drove to Best Buy and spent about $80 on a small GPS tracker, the kind people used to keep tabs on their kids or elderly parents. It was roughly the size of a matchbox, magnetic, and had a battery life of about 2 weeks. More importantly, it could be tracked in real time through a smartphone app. My plan was simple. I'd go to Margaret's house, politely ask for my roof rake back while explaining I'd ordered materials for a storage shed, and then secretly attach the GPS tracker to the rake. If she refused to return it, at least I'd know where it was. If she did return it, well, I'd remove the tracker and return it to Best Buy. Either way, I'd have some leverage. Margaret lived in the nicest part of Whispering Pines, in a sprawling 2-story brick colonial with a 3-car garage and professional landscaping that probably cost more than my annual salary. Her husband, Richard, was some kind of executive at a manufacturing company in Auburn Hills, and from what I'd gathered from neighborhood gossip, he spent most of his time traveling to avoid being home with his wife. They had 2 kids, both away at college, which left Margaret with nothing to do but terrorize the neighborhood and attend her book club where they probably discussed 50 shades of beige paint. I rang her doorbell at 4 in the afternoon, having rehearsed my diplomatic speech. The tracker was in my coat pocket, already activated and paired with my phone. Margaret answered wearing designer athleisure wear, the kind that had never seen actual exercise, and holding a glass of white wine even though it was barely evening. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said coldly. "I don't recall us having an appointment." "We don't," I said, forcing a smile. "I just wanted to let you know that I've ordered materials for a storage solution. Should be delivered next week. I was hoping I could get my roof rake back in the meantime since we've got more snow coming." Materials ordered isn't the same as architectural committee approval, Margaret said, making no move to invite me in from the cold. The process is clearly outlined. You need to submit detailed plans, including measurements, materials list, and color selections. Then the committee reviews them at our monthly meeting. Your monthly meeting isn't for 3 more weeks, I said, my patience starting to fray. And we're talking about a small shed, not an addition to my house. Standards are standards. She started to close the door, but I put my hand out to stop it. Margaret, I need that rake. My roof can't handle another heavy snow without proper maintenance. You know what happened last year? Something flickered in her eyes, something that looked almost like satisfaction. Perhaps you should have thought about that before violating community standards. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dinner preparations. She shut the door firmly in my face. I stood on her porch for a long moment, fury building in my chest. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about control, about Margaret getting off on making other people's lives difficult. I walked back to my truck, got in, and just sat there trying to calm down. The tracker felt heavy in my pocket, and I realized my original plan wasn't going to work. I couldn't exactly break into her house to attach a GPS device to my own property. Then I remembered something. Margaret's garage. She'd opened it when I'd driven up, probably pulling in from wherever she'd been that afternoon. I'd seen it for just a moment, but I was pretty sure I'd spotted my roof rake leaning against the wall near her recycling bins. The garage had windows on the side, old-style ones that looked into the space. If I could just verify the rake was there and maybe figure out when she might leave the garage accessible, I could retrieve my own property. I drove around the block and parked on the street behind Margaret's house. Her property backed up to a small wooded area, and there was a walking path that ran through it. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, then walked the path until I was behind her house. It was starting to get dark, and lights were on inside her home. I felt like an absolute creep, but I reminded myself that she'd stolen from me first. The garage windows were about 7 feet off the ground, but there was a decorative boulder in her landscaping that gave me enough height to peek inside. Sure enough, there was my roof rake, along with what looked like several other items that definitely didn't belong to her. I saw a pressure washer that looked like the one Tom Chen had mentioned went missing last month. There was a folding ladder that might have been the Johnsons from 3 doors down. And was that a leaf blower with the Harrises' address written on it in Sharpie? My mind raced. Margaret wasn't just confiscating my stuff. She was apparently running some kind of HOA theft ring, taking people's equipment under the guise of bylaw enforcement. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures through the window, making sure to capture as much detail as possible. The flash seemed incredibly bright in the growing darkness, and I half expected Margaret to come running out, but the house remained quiet. I walked back to my truck, my thoughts spinning. This was bigger than I'd realized. If I was right about those other items, Margaret had been systematically stealing from neighbors for months, maybe longer. The question was what to do about it. I could confront her, but she'd just deny everything. I could tell the other neighbors, but without proof, it was my word against the HOA president's. That's when I remembered the GPS tracker. Even if I couldn't attach it to my rake right now, what if Margaret moved the items? What if she was selling them or storing them somewhere else? I needed to know what she was doing with all the confiscated property. But getting into her garage to plant the tracker seemed impossible without breaking and entering, which would make me the criminal. I was still mulling this over when I got home and found a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from Margaret, on official HOA letterhead, informing me that I was being fined $500 for aggressive confrontation of an HOA board member, and that I was now on probation, meaning any further violations would result in a lien against my property. The letter was dated today and had been notarized, meaning she'd gone to the trouble of driving to a notary public after our conversation just to make this official. This woman was unbelievable. I took pictures of the letter and texted them to Derek, who called me back immediately. "Dude, this is harassment. She can't fine you for knocking on her door." "Tell that to the lien she's threatening," I said, slumping onto my couch. "Derek, I think this is bigger than my roof rake. I saw inside her garage. She's got all kinds of stuff that doesn't belong to her." "You saw inside her garage, how exactly?" Derek asked carefully. "I was on public property on the walking path," I said, which was technically true. "The windows are right there. I wasn't trespassing." "Okay, good, don't trespass." "But if she's actually stealing from multiple neighbors, that's legit criminal activity. You should call the police." "And tell them what?" "The HOA president is confiscating property under bylaw enforcement, but I think she's keeping it. They'll tell me it's a civil matter." Derek was quiet for a moment. "You might be right, but document everything. Take pictures, save all correspondence, and see if you can get other neighbors to file complaints too. There's strength in numbers." After we hung up, I spent the evening reaching out to neighbors. I started with Tom Chen, who came over immediately when I told him I might have found his missing pressure washer. Tom was in his 50s, a civil engineer who'd lived in Whispering Pines for a decade. He'd always been friendly, the kind of neighbor who'd help you jump your car or lend you tools. "I knew that thing didn't just walk away," Tom said, looking at the photos on my phone. "Margaret told me I must have left it outside during trash day and someone probably grabbed it. She made me feel like an idiot for not securing my own property." "Do you have any documentation that she confiscated it?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "She never said she took it. She just showed up one day, said it had been sitting outside my garage and that it was an eyesore. I told her I'd move it, but when I went to get it later that day, it was gone." I assumed she was right, that someone had stolen it. We called the Harrises, an elderly couple 2 streets over. Helen Harris answered and sounded surprised to hear from us. When I described the leaf blower in Margaret's garage, she gasped. "That's mine." Margaret said it was blowing grass clippings onto the sidewalk, which was a violation. She said she'd hold on to it until I hired a proper landscaping service that met community standards. But that was 4 months ago, and every time I ask about it, she says I need to submit more paperwork. Within 2 hours, I'd identified 6 neighbors who'd had property confiscated by Margaret that had never been returned. The list included my roof rake, Tom's pressure washer, Helen's leaf blower, an extension ladder belonging to the Johnsons, a paint sprayer from the Rodriguez family, and a shop vacuum from single mom Brenda Wilson, who lived at the end of the street. We all gathered in my living room, and I could see the anger building as everyone shared their stories. Margaret had used different tactics with each person, always framing the confiscation as temporary, always requiring some impossible standard before return. With Brenda, she'd claimed the shop vac was too loud and violated quiet hours. With the Rodriguez family, she'd said the paint sprayer was a commercial-grade tool that wasn't approved for residential use. "This is theft," Brenda said, her voice shaking with anger. "Plain and simple. She's been stealing from us and hiding behind the HOA. We need to go to the police," Tom said firmly. "This isn't a civil matter anymore if she's deliberately taking property with no intention of returning it." I pulled out the GPS tracker I'd bought earlier. "I have an idea, but it's a little bit risky. If we can prove she's moving or selling our stuff, we'd have a stronger case." I explained my plan. We'd keep watch on Margaret's house, wait for an opportunity when her garage was open, and I'd quickly attach the tracker to one of the larger items, probably Tom's pressure washer since it was expensive and easily transportable. Then, we'd monitor where it went. If Margaret moved it to a storage unit or tried to sell it, we'd have evidence of actual theft rather than just overzealous HOA enforcement. "I don't know," Helen said nervously. "What if you get caught?" "It's my property I'd be tracking," Tom pointed out. "If Ian gets caught putting a GPS tracker on my pressure washer, which I've given him permission to do, that's not illegal." "Actually," Derek said when I called him back to verify, "that's a gray area." "But if Tom reported his property stolen and you were helping him locate it, you'd probably be okay. The key is filing a police report first." Tom went down to the Rochester Hills Police Department that night and filed a report for stolen property. He listed his pressure washer, provided the serial number he'd fortunately recorded, and explained the situation with Margaret and the HOA. The officer who took the report was skeptical but professional. He explained that HOA disputes were usually civil matters, but if Tom believed his property had been stolen, he had a right to file a report. Armed with the police report number, we felt more confident about the next step. The challenge was getting access to Margaret's garage. We couldn't break in, and we couldn't trespass. We needed her to open it voluntarily, or we needed to wait for a mistake. The opportunity came 2 days later. Margaret had a standing hair appointment every Thursday at 10 in the morning at a salon in downtown Rochester. Brenda knew this because they'd once used the same stylist before Brenda switched to avoid Margaret. On Thursday morning, Tom and I watched from my truck parked 2 streets over. At 9:45, Margaret's white Lexus SUV pulled out of her garage and we saw it. She'd left the garage door open. "She probably forgot to close it," Tom whispered, even though we were alone in the truck. "She's always in a hurry for that appointment because they charge her if she's late." "How long does she usually take?" I asked, my heart pounding. "At least 90 minutes. Hair, nails, the works." We waited 5 more minutes to be sure she wasn't coming back, then drove to her street. I parked around the corner and we walked up casually, like neighbors out for a stroll. Margaret's garage was indeed wide open, the door still raised. Anyone passing by could see inside, which gave us legal cover. We weren't breaking in, we were responding to an open garage. Still, my hands shook as I pulled out the GPS tracker. Tom stood watch while I walked into the garage like I had every right to be there. Up close, I could see even more items that probably didn't belong to Margaret. Garden tools, extension cords, even a few small pieces of furniture. This woman was a full-blown kleptomaniac hiding behind HOA authority. I found Tom's pressure washer exactly where I'd seen it through the window. It was a nice DeWalt model, probably worth $400 or $500. The GPS tracker was magnetic, designed to attach to vehicles, and it stuck perfectly to the metal frame of the pressure washer, hidden underneath where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking. I activated it through my phone app, saw the little blue dot appear on the map, and then got out of there as fast as possible. "Done?" Tom asked as we walked back to my truck. "Done. Now we wait and see what she does with it. For 3 days, nothing happened." The GPS tracker showed Tom's pressure washer sitting in Margaret's garage, barely moving. We started to wonder if she really was just holding onto the items indefinitely, some kind of weird power move with no end game. Then, on Sunday afternoon, the tracker started moving. I was watching a game when my phone buzzed with an alert. The pressure washer was on the move, heading south on I-75. I called Tom immediately. "She's got your pressure washer in her car. She's heading toward Detroit." "What the hell is she doing?" Tom asked. "Should we follow her?" Already getting my keys. I know it sounds crazy, following the HOA president through suburban Michigan on a Sunday afternoon, but we'd come this far. Tom met me at the end of his driveway, and we pulled up the tracking app on his phone so we could navigate. Margaret was moving steadily south, past Sterling Heights, past Warren into Detroit proper. Maybe she's visiting family, Tom suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. With your pressure washer. Margaret's Lexus, according to the GPS tracker, finally stopped at a location in Detroit's east side, near Gratiot Avenue. When we pulled up 15 minutes later, we found ourselves outside a second-hand tool and equipment shop called Motor City Resale. It was the kind of place that bought and sold used tools, lawn equipment, and random household items, no questions asked. "She's selling our stuff," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "She's been stealing from the neighborhood and selling it for cash." Through the shop's front window, we could see Margaret talking to the man behind the counter. She had 2 large bags with her, and as we watched, she pulled out what looked like the paint sprayer I'd seen in her garage. The shop owner examined it, and they appeared to be negotiating. "We need to call the police," I said. "Right now. This is actual theft." Tom was already dialing. He spoke with the dispatcher, explained that his stolen property was currently inside the shop, and provided the report number from his earlier filing. The dispatcher said they'd send an officer, but it might take 20 to 30 minutes given the location and current call volume. We sat in my truck, watching Margaret through the window. She looked so normal, so unremarkable. Just a middle-aged woman in expensive jeans and a North Face jacket, conducting what appeared to be a routine transaction. You'd never guess she'd been systematically robbing her neighbors for months. After about 10 minutes, Margaret exited the shop without any bags but with what appeared to be cash that she stuffed into her purse. She got back in her Lexus and drove away, not noticing us parked down the street. The GPS tracker showed the pressure washer was still inside the shop. "She left it there," Tom said. "She actually sold my pressure washer." A Rochester Hills police cruiser arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out and we approached them carefully, not wanting to look threatening. Tom showed them his police report and explained the situation. I showed them the GPS tracking app and the photos I'd taken of Margaret's garage. Officer Janet Morrison, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, listened carefully. "So you're telling me your HOA president has been confiscating property under the guise of bylaw enforcement, but she's actually been selling the items for personal profit?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Tom confirmed. "My pressure washer is inside that shop right now. The tracker proves it." The officers entered Motor City Resale, and Tom and I waited outside. Through the window, we could see them talking to the shop owner, showing him something on their phones. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes before Officer Morrison came back out. "The owner confirms that a woman matching your description sold him a pressure washer about 30 minutes ago, along with several other items. He still has the pressure washer. If you can identify it and verify the serial number, we can seize it as evidence." Tom practically ran into the shop. The pressure washer was behind the counter, and when Tom checked the serial number, it matched his records exactly. Officer Morrison photographed it, tagged it, and had the shop owner write a statement describing Margaret, her vehicle, and the transaction. "This is enough for us to bring her in for questioning," Officer Morrison said. "If she's been doing this to multiple neighbors, we're talking about organized theft. That's a felony depending on the value of items taken." We gave statements right there on the street, and I showed the officers all the photos I'd taken, plus the text messages and emails from Margaret regarding my roof rake. Officer Morrison looked through everything carefully. "Mr. Zimmerman, I need to know exactly how you obtained photos from inside Miss Templeton's garage, she said carefully. I explained about the walking path, the windows, taking pictures from public property. She nodded slowly. Okay, that's legal, and the GPS tracker. Tom filed a police report for stolen property. I was helping him locate it. The tracker was placed on his property with his permission. All right. Bit of a gray area, but given the circumstances, I think we're okay. The important thing is we have evidence of her selling stolen property. Officer Morrison closed her notebook. We'll be contacting Miss Templeton today. I'd recommend you both be prepared for some fallout in your neighborhood. That was an understatement. News spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew that Margaret Templeton, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of community standards, was being investigated for theft. Some neighbors were shocked. Others, like Tom and me, felt vindicated. A few, particularly Margaret's friends from the book club, insisted there had to be some mistake. Margaret's husband Richard came home from his business trip to find police at his house. From what we heard through the neighborhood gossip network, he was absolutely blindsided. He'd had no idea what Margaret was doing. The police obtained a warrant to search the garage, and they found dozens of items belonging to various neighbors. Some people didn't even realize their stuff was missing until police called them to identify property. The investigation grew quickly. It turned out Margaret had been selling neighborhood equipment for almost a year. The police estimated she'd made over $15,000 through her scheme. The shop owner in Detroit wasn't the only place she'd been selling. Police found evidence of online sales, transactions at pawn shops in multiple cities, even sales through Facebook Marketplace under a fake name. What made it worse was that Margaret had been using her HOA position deliberately to facilitate the theft. She'd rewrite bylaws to create violations, target specific equipment she knew she could sell, and gaslight neighbors into thinking they'd been careless or that the confiscations were legitimate. It was calculated, methodical, and completely illegal. Margaret was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I happened to be getting my mail when the police cruiser pulled up to her house. She came out in handcuffs, her face red and blotchy from crying. Richard stood in the doorway looking completely destroyed. Whatever their marriage had been before, this was going to end it. The charges were serious. Multiple counts of larceny, organized theft, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty since she'd been acting in her capacity as HOA president. The prosecutor's office took the case seriously because it involved a position of trust and authority being used to commit crimes against vulnerable community members. Helen Harris, the elderly woman whose leaf blower had been taken, was particularly sympathetic as a victim. I got my roof rake back the day the police searched Margaret's garage. They returned all the confiscated property to the rightful owners, documenting everything carefully for the criminal case. Standing in my garage, holding that cheap aluminum rake, I felt a weird mix of emotions. Relief, definitely. Vindication, absolutely. But also something like sadness for how far Margaret had fallen into her own delusions of power and control. The HOA had to hold an emergency meeting to remove Margaret from the board and elect interim leadership. Tom Chen volunteered as temporary president, and one of his first acts was to review all the bylaw changes Margaret had implemented. Turned out about half of them weren't even legal according to Michigan HOA regulations. She just made stuff up and counted on nobody challenging her. The criminal case moved through the system faster than I expected. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue that she'd had a psychological breakdown, that the stress of managing the HOA and her empty nest syndrome had caused some kind of mental health crisis. The prosecutor, wasn't buying it. The organized nature of the thefts, the multiple sales locations, the fake online identity, all of it pointed to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. In August, 7 months after she'd stolen my roof rake, Margaret pleaded guilty to multiple felony theft charges as part of a plea agreement. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to all victims plus additional fines. The judge was particularly harsh in his statement, noting that Margaret had betrayed the trust of her entire community and used a position of authority to prey on her neighbors. Richard divorced her while she was in county jail awaiting sentencing. Their house went up for sale, and it sold within a week to a young family from Bloomfield Hills. The new neighbors seemed nice, and they definitely weren't interested in joining the HOA board. The whole experience changed Whispering Pines in unexpected ways. The new HOA board, led by Tom, implemented actual oversight and accountability measures. No single person could make unilateral decisions anymore. All enforcement actions had to be documented and approved by at least 3 board members. Fines over $100 required a hearing where homeowners could defend themselves. It was like we'd collectively realized how close we'd come to living under a petty tyrant, and decided to build actual democratic systems to prevent it from happening again. I ran into Officer Morrison at a coffee shop in downtown Rochester Hills about a year after everything went down. She remembered me immediately. "Mr. Zimmerman, how's life in the subdivision?" "Quieter," I said with a laugh. "Much quieter. New HOA president actually acts like a human being." "That tracker idea was pretty clever," she admitted. "Made our job a lot easier. Though for the record, I can't officially endorse civilians conducting their own surveillance operations." "Understood. For the record, I was just trying to find my roof rake." She grinned. "Right, your roof rake. Well, I'm glad it worked out. Not every HOA dispute ends with actual justice. Looking back now, the whole thing seems almost surreal. It started with such a small, petty violation, the kind of thing that happens in neighborhoods across America every day. HOA boards overstepping, residents getting frustrated. Everyone trapped in these bizarre power dynamics over things like where you can store a rake or what color you can paint your mailbox. But underneath Margaret's tyranny had been real criminal behavior, and if I hadn't pushed back, if I hadn't gotten curious about what she was really doing, she might have continued stealing from us indefinitely. The GPS tracker was the key to everything. That $80 device from Best Buy provided the evidence we needed to prove Margaret wasn't just being difficult, she was being criminal. It tracked her from her garage to that resale shop in Detroit, created a digital trail that was impossible to deny, and gave the police probable cause to search her property and build their case. Some neighbors thanked me afterward, said I'd been brave to stand up to Margaret when everyone else had been too intimidated. I didn't feel brave. I felt annoyed, then angry, then determined. I just wanted my roof rake back. I wanted to be able to clear snow from my roof without worrying about ice dams and water damage. Everything that came after was just following the evidence where it led. The story became a bit of a legend in Rochester Hills. People I'd never met would recognize my name and ask if I was the guy who'd caught the HOA president. Local media had covered the case, especially after Margaret's sentencing. HOA president stole from neighbors, sold items for personal profit, read the headline in the Oakland Press. The Detroit Free Press did a longer piece about HOA abuse and accountability, using our case as the centerpiece. I even got interviewed for a national homeowner advocacy website about what red flags to watch for in HOA leadership. My advice was simple: Demand transparency, document everything, and don't assume someone is acting legally just because they're in a position of authority. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts and don't be afraid to ask questions. Brenda Wilson, the single mom who'd had her shop vacuum confiscated, told me later that Margaret had been particularly harsh with her because Brenda had questioned the HOA's spending on landscaping contracts. Margaret had apparently been skimming money from those contracts too, though that investigation was still ongoing when I last heard about it. The theft of personal property had just been one piece of a larger pattern of fraud and abuse. The restitution money came slowly. Margaret had spent most of what she'd made from selling our stuff, and her assets were tied up in the divorce. Eventually, I got a check for $30 to replace my roof rake, plus about $200 for what the court calculated as damages for the stress and inconvenience. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about the principle, about holding someone accountable who thought they were above the rules they so aggressively enforced on everyone else. Tom Chen turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He served for 2 years before passing the role to another neighbor, and during his tenure, he focused on actual community building rather than enforcement. We had neighborhood barbecues, a community garden project, and an online group where people could share tools and equipment rather than everyone buying their own. It was like we'd collectively decided to be the opposite of Margaret's vision for Whispering Pines. My life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after living through something that bizarre. I kept the GPS tracker, though I never used it again. It sat in a drawer in my garage, a little piece of technology that had been so crucial to bringing down a neighborhood tyrant. Sometimes I'd see it while looking for a screwdriver or a roll of duct tape, and I'd remember that whole crazy winter. The roof rake itself became a bit of a symbol. I kept using it every winter, and every time I did, at least one neighbor would make a joke about keeping it under armed guard. I'd laugh, because what else could you do? The whole situation had been so absurd, so unnecessarily dramatic, that all you could do was laugh and be grateful it was over. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that HOAs, despite being common and often necessary for maintaining property values, can become vehicles for petty tyranny if there's no oversight. I learned that standing up to bullies, even suburban bullies with clipboards and bylaws, sometimes requires creativity and persistence. And I learned that a $30 roof rake could become the linchpin of a felony theft investigation if you were willing to follow the evidence. Margaret served her full sentence. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she moved somewhere downstate after her release, maybe Ann Arbor or Ypsilanti, trying to rebuild her life away from the community she'd terrorized. I didn't follow up on it. Her fate wasn't my concern once justice had been served. I was more interested in making sure Whispering Pines became the kind of neighborhood where that kind of abuse couldn't happen again. The Architectural Review Committee, which Margaret had used as a weapon to harass residents with endless paperwork requirements, was completely reformed. Reasonable timelines were established for reviewing requests. Standard items like sheds, fences, and paint colors were pre-approved as long as they met basic aesthetic guidelines. The whole process became transparent and efficient, instead of being a bureaucratic nightmare designed to frustrate homeowners into compliance. Property values in Whispering Pines actually increased after Margaret's removal. Turned out that having a reasonable HOA that focused on maintaining common areas and enforcing genuinely important standards, like not letting your property fall into complete disrepair, was better for home prices than having a dictator who terrorized everyone over minor infractions. Several families who'd been considering moving decided to stay. New families moving in commented on how welcoming and reasonable the neighborhood felt. I kept in touch with the other victims of Margaret's theft ring. We formed an informal support group, meeting occasionally for coffee or dinner to share our experiences and laugh about the absurdity of it all. Helen Harris became a good friend. She was sharp as a tack despite being in her 70s, and she'd never let Margaret's gaslighting make her doubt herself. When her leaf blower went missing, Helen had known something was wrong, but like the rest of us, she'd been unsure how to fight someone who had the weight of the HOA behind them. The legal system had worked eventually, but it required us pushing it, providing evidence, refusing to accept Margaret's version of events. If Tom hadn't filed that police report, if I hadn't tracked the pressure washer, if we hadn't worked together to document everything, Margaret might still be in power, still stealing, still making our lives miserable over invented violations and arbitrary rules. There's a broader lesson in there somewhere about community, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's easier to just pay the fine and move on. HOAs exist in a weird legal gray area where they have significant power over your property and daily life, but they're also just volunteer organizations run by your neighbors. When those neighbors abuse their power, fighting back can feel overwhelming, but it's necessary. I started attending HOA meetings regularly after everything settled down. Not because I enjoyed sitting in folding chairs in the community clubhouse, talking about snow removal contracts and pool maintenance schedules, but because I'd learned the hard way that these organizations only function properly when residents pay attention. Tyranny, even suburban tyranny, thrives in apathy. The moment everyone just trusts the board to handle things without oversight is the moment someone like Margaret can take control. The story of my stolen roof rake and the GPS tracker that brought down an HOA president became something I'd tell at parties when people asked about my neighborhood. It always got a good reaction. That moment when I'd reveal that the whole investigation hinged on an $80 tracking device from Best Buy. People were fascinated by the combination of high-tech solution and utterly mundane suburban problem. But underneath, the entertaining aspects of the story was something more serious. Margaret had violated the trust of dozens of families. She'd made people feel unsafe in their own homes, uncertain about their own property rights, anxious about trivial violations that could result in fines or harassment. That's not how neighborhoods should function. That's not how communities should feel. In the end, a $30 roof rake and an $80 GPS tracker were the tools that restored justice to Whispering Pines. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought over the smallest things, because those small things represent larger principles. My right to store a snow removal tool by my garage without having it stolen wasn't really about the rake itself. It was about autonomy, property rights, and freedom from arbitrary authority. Margaret is out of prison now, living somewhere else, hopefully getting the help she clearly needed. Richard rebuilt his life, stayed in touch with some of the neighbors who'd known him apart from his ex-wife's crimes. Their kids, from what I heard, were devastated but supportive of their father. The whole situation had destroyed their family, all because one woman couldn't separate her identity from her role as HOA president, and descended into criminal behavior to maintain her sense of control. I still live in Whispering Pines. My roof rake still leans against my garage sometimes when I'm actively using it, and nobody says a word. The HOA functions smoothly under reasonable leadership. Property looks good, people are friendly, And there's a sense of community that I don't think existed when everyone was walking on eggshells around Margaret. That GPS tracker is still in my garage drawer. I've thought about returning it to Best Buy, but I never did. It sits there as a reminder that sometimes you have to get creative to fight injustice, even when that injustice comes in the form of a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. It reminds me that technology can be a tool for accountability, and that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. The police, the courts, the legal system all did their jobs once we provided them with evidence they couldn't ignore. Officer Morrison and the Rochester Hills Police Department took our complaints seriously and investigated thoroughly. The prosecutor built a solid case. The judge handed down appropriate sentences. The system worked because we made it work by refusing to accept Margaret's abuse as normal or inevitable. Looking at my neighborhood now, 3 years after that February morning when Margaret stole my roof rake, I feel a sense of satisfaction. We fixed something that was broken. We removed a cancer from our community and rebuilt something healthier in its place. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fun, and there were moments when I wondered if it was worth the effort over a stupid aluminum rake. But it was worth it. Not because of the rake, but because of what fighting for it represented. Standing up to bullies matters. Demanding accountability from people in power matters. Protecting your rights and your community matters. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, facing down an abusive HOA board or a petty tyrant with a clipboard, remember that you have options. Document everything. Connect with your neighbors. Don't be afraid to involve law enforcement if actual crimes are being committed. And maybe, just maybe, consider investing in a GPS tracker. You never know when that little device might be exactly what you need to prove the truth and restore justice to your corner of suburban America.